The call came on a Tuesday. "Your mother is gone," the hospice nurse said, her voice gentle as worn cotton. "Just slipped away in her sleep." I nodded, the phone pressed hard to my ear, standing in the kitchen of my own quiet apartment. I was 48 years old, and I had just become an orphan. The funeral was a small, tidy affair. My mother, Margaret, had been a woman of quiet routines and smaller expectations. She had lived in the same little house for 50 years, surrounded by the same furniture, following the same paths. My father had left when I was 6, a blurry memory of raised voices and a slamming door. It was just her and me after that. We were a pair, but not a close one. Our love was expressed in practicalities: a warm meal, a mended hem, the reliable presence in the next room. We were two quiet planets orbiting the same sun, never colliding, never speaking of the void my father left behind. Now the task of clearing her house fell to me. It felt like a violation. Every drawer held a lifetime of careful accumulation. In her bedroom, I folded her sensible cotton nightgowns. In the living room, I dusted the porcelain figurines she'd collected, each one perfectly placed. The air smelled of lemon polish and stillness. It was in the kitchen, on the third day, that I found it. Tucked at the back of the highest cupboard, behind a stack of never-used serving platters, was an old metal recipe box. It was rusted at the corners, the once red paint faded to a dusty pink. This was odd. My mother was not a sentimental cook. Her repertoire was functional: a sturdy meatloaf, a reliable pot roast, simple cookies for church functions. She had no need for a recipe box. Her knowledge was in her hands. I carried it to the small Formica table, the same one where I'd done my homework, where we'd eaten thousands of silent meals. I lifted the lid. It wasn't filled with recipes. On top was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them, a small velvet pouch, heavy for its size. And at the very bottom, a single, sealed envelope with my name on it. For Clara, in my mother's neat schoolteacher script. My heart began a slow, heavy thud. I untied the ribbon first. The letters were from my father, not the angry final ones I might have expected, but love letters. Dozens of them. They spanned the 2 years before I was born. "My dearest Maggie," the first one began. "Every minute away from you is a year. This job in the city is a prison, but the thought of you waiting for me is the key. I'll be home Friday. Save a dance for me." I read on, my hands trembling. The man in these letters was a stranger. He was passionate, poetic, full of grand dreams. He wrote of buying a boat and sailing the world with her. He wrote of the little house by the sea they would have, filled with the sound of laughter and children. He called her his starlight, his wild north wind. What happened to this man? The father I remembered was a sullen shadow, a man who scowled at his dinner and left his clothes on the floor. There was no wild north wind in my mother. There was only quiet endurance. I reached for the velvet pouch. I loosened the drawstring and tipped it onto the table. A cascade of gold and gemstones spilled out, catching the weak kitchen light. A heavy, ornate locket. A pair of earrings with deep blue sapphires. A man's signet ring. A stack of gold coins. And at the bottom, a bank book. I opened it. The account was in my mother's name. The first entry was dated a month after my father left. A deposit of $5,000. And then, every month for 42 years, a deposit. Sometimes $100, sometimes $500. The balance, as of last month, was $842,367.11. I stared at the number. $842,000. My mother, who had clipped coupons, who had patched the elbows of my sweaters, who had worked as a low-level secretary for the county for 40 years, had been sitting on a fortune. A cold dread began to creep up my spine. This was not savings. This was a secret. With numb fingers, I finally picked up the envelope with my name on it. I broke the seal. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found my box of secrets. I am sorry. Sorry for the silence. And sorry for the shock. I have carried this truth for so long, it feels a part of my bones. But you deserve to know who your mother really was. The man in those letters was your father. The real one. His name was Thomas. He was everything I ever dreamed of. Wild, brilliant, and full of a fire that warmed my cautious soul. We were going to have a grand adventure. We were married in a small courthouse ceremony. No one knew. We were saving the money for our boat, for our life at sea. And then I got pregnant with you." He was overjoyed, but the world was not. His family was wealthy, powerful. They had plans for him that did not include a pregnant, small-town wife. They gave him an ultimatum: leave me and the child, or be disinherited and ruined. He chose them. He came to me one last time. He was broken. He gave me that jewelry, heirlooms he had taken from his family's vault. He gave me the cash he had saved. He told me it was for you. For us. He made me promise to never tell anyone he was your father. He said his family would destroy us if they knew you existed. He said it was the only way to keep us safe. The man you knew as your father was a different man. A kind, lonely man I married a year later, out of desperation and fear. I gave him a home, and he gave you a name, but his heart was as broken as mine, and he couldn't stay. He left, and I didn't blame him. I had nothing left to give, so I built a wall. I buried the wild girl Thomas loved. I became Margaret, the careful one, the quiet one. I put every piece of jewelry he gave me in that box. I put every dollar of that money in the bank. It was blood money, Clara. Money that paid for our silence, for our safety. But it was also your inheritance, from your real father. I never spent a cent of it. It felt tainted. It felt like the price he paid to erase us. But you are not tainted. You are the best part of him, and the best part of me. You are the love that was supposed to be. The money is yours. Do with it what I never could. Be bold. Be brave. See the world. Buy the little house by the sea. Live the life we dreamed of. The locket has a picture of him inside. I have loved you every day of your life. Forgive me for the lie I had to live. Mom, I sat in the profound silence of the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand. The world I had known, the foundation of my entire life, had just been pulled out from under me. The sullen, absent father was a fiction. My mother's quiet sadness was not a personality trait. It was a monument to a colossal, lifelong grief. I picked up the locket. It was cool and heavy in my palm. My fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open. On one side was a small, faded photograph of my mother, young and breathtakingly beautiful, her head thrown back in laughter. On the other side was a man I had never seen, but whose eyes I recognized. They were my own. He had my strong jaw, my dark, unruly hair. He was handsome, his smile confident, his arm wrapped possessively around my mother. He looked alive. He looked like the man in the letters. A sob escaped me, raw and sudden, echoing in the empty house. I cried for my mother, who had locked her heart away in a metal box. I cried for the man in the picture, who had chosen money over his own family. And I cried for the little girl I had been, who had grown up believing she was the source of her mother's sadness, when all along I had been the only thing that made it bearable. The following weeks were a haze of disorientation. I went through the motions of legally closing my mother's estate, but my mind was in that kitchen, with that box. The money sat in the bank, a monstrous, complicated fortune. It wasn't a gift, it was a ghost. I hired a private investigator. I gave him the name Thomas, the photograph, the dates from the letters. It took him less than a week. Thomas Winslow, scion of the Winslow shipping fortune. He had never sailed the world. He had become the CEO of his family's company. He had married a woman from his own social circle. He had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. He had died 5 years ago of a heart attack. His obituary was long and glowing, listing his accomplishments, his philanthropy, his beloved family. There was no mention of a first wife, no mention of a daughter named Clara. He had done exactly what he said he would. He had erased us. His children were still alive. My half-brothers and half-sister. They lived in a world of private schools and summer homes, a world I could only imagine. They had inherited everything. And I had inherited his guilt money. The anger came then, hot and cleansing. It wasn't just for me, but for my mother. For the life of quiet desperation she had endured, while he lived in luxury, his conscience bought and paid for with monthly deposits into a secret account. I didn't want his money, but I realized, with a cold, clear certainty, that my mother had been wrong. This wasn't just my inheritance. It was my weapon. I found the best, most ruthless lawyer I could. I showed her the letters, the bank book, the DNA test I had quietly taken. I am Thomas Winslow's firstborn child, I said, my voice steady, and I intend to claim my share of his estate. The lawsuit was explosive. It made the papers. Shipping magnate's secret daughter emerges. My half-siblings fought back viciously, calling me a gold digger, a fraud. But the evidence was undeniable. The letters, the dates, the money trail, the DNA. It was a story a jury could understand. A story of a powerful man who abandoned his family and paid to keep them quiet. We settled out of court. They didn't want the public spectacle. They offered me $10 million. I took it. The money was transferred. The news stories faded. My half-siblings never contacted me, and I had no desire to contact them. The war was over. I stood once more in my mother's quiet kitchen. It was all over. The house was empty, ready to be sold. But I felt a strange peace. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was just silence. I had done what my mother could not. I had faced the ghost, and I had won. But the victory felt hollow. The money was a number in a bank account. It didn't fill the hole my father had left. It didn't bring back my mother's laughter. And then I knew what to do. I used a small part of the money to buy a cottage. Not by the sea, but in the mountains. A place with a big, sunlit room with north-facing windows. I moved my mother's old recipe box there, placing it on the mantel. It was no longer a box of secrets. It was a box of truth. With the rest of the money, I started a foundation. The Margaret Foundation, named for the quiet, brave woman who had endured. It provides housing and support for single mothers, women who, like her, are left to build a life from the rubble of someone else's choices. I never found the grand adventure my parents dreamed of. I didn't need to. My adventure was here, in this quiet life I was building for myself. I paint now. I grow tomatoes. I sit on my porch and watch the light change on the mountains. Sometimes, I take the locket out and look at the picture of my parents, young and so desperately in love. I don't feel anger anymore. I feel a deep, abiding sadness for them both, for the lives they lost. My mother's final secret wasn't the money. It was the truth. And the truth, however painful, did not break me. It broke the chains of a story I had never known I was living. It showed me that the quietest lives can hold the loudest revolutions, and that the greatest inheritance is not a fortune, but the courage to finally, after a lifetime, live an authentic one.